Casser-Jayne, and welcome to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, a podcast akin to the great salons of times past. Pour yourself a martini, grab a spot on your favorite sofa, and listen to the great artists, writers, politicians, and celebrities of our day discuss and debate the current political and economic scene, art and music, film, literature, or maybe talk about the newest trends in fashion, design, and haute cuisine. Whether it's the current political cocktail or the latest must-read award-winning book, we tackle all topics and like to stir and sometimes shake things up. On this episode of the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, we begin with Podcast America, our weekly politics segment in which veteran White House correspondent Matthew Cooper and I slice and dice the current political landscape as we near November 6th and the midterm elections. And joining me in the second half hour, a very, very smart woman who has written a fascinating new book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers: How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire Our World. Distinguished cultural psychologist Michele Gelfand. Stay tuned and enjoy the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Let's get to it. Journalist and veteran White House correspondent Matthew Cooper is known for his in-depth reporting and analysis from Washington, D.C. Mr. Cooper has worked for some of America's most prestigious magazines, including Time, Newsweek, The New Republic, National Journal, and U.S. News and World Report. He now serves as a contributing editor to Washingtonian magazine. For the record, Cooper also earned national attention during the CIA leak case, when he was held in contempt of court and threatened with imprisonment for his refusal to name his sources and to testify before the grand jury regarding the Valerie Plame CIA leak investigation, a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. He's appeared on 60 Minutes, Meet the Press, Hardball, The O'Reilly Factor, and This Week with George Stephanopoulos. He's covered Donald Trump extensively, his hard-hitting and insightful profiles of the Donald, always well worth the read. And now, from here until Election Day, Matt will be my co-host on our new segment, Podcast America. I hope you enjoy. Let's talk. All right, so let's talk. Nice to have you back. My
Thanks.
Partner in all of this craziness.
My pleasure.
Matt, we begin with breaking news. Who said that the universe doesn't have a sense of humor? I mean, amid Trump and the GOP's defense of Kavanaugh, that allegations happened decades ago, Bill Cosby is sentenced to 3 to 10 years in prison for something that happened decades ago, right?
Yeah.
Amazing. Victim Andrea Constant. This is extraordinary. Here's what she said. She said, he took my beautiful spirit and he crushed it. Heart goes out to her. I imagine Christine Blasey Ford and Deborah Ramirez can relate. This has got to give pause to some of those hardened Republicans. No? Yes?
I don't know if the two really will relate in the minds of senators, but look, they're all very focused on the Kavanaugh thing. All our eyes are on Thursday's hearing with Kavanaugh and Dr. Ford, his accuser, and we'll see what happens.
We'll see if they have heart. Before we get to that, I want to talk also about the fact that today the president was speaking at the United Nations General Assembly.
Sure.
Oh my God, he was laughed at. Let me give the audience what happened in case they don't know. This is what he said. He said, in less than 2 years, my administration has accomplished almost more than any other administration in the history of our country. And it got a laugh. He was quick to retort, I didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay. This afternoon, Matt, he tried to make a joke of it and said, we planned it. He planned it. Here's my take. I thought he was insouciant. I thought he was insolent. I thought he was taunting. But I also thought he was oddly languid. It was a weird performance by him.
Yeah, well, it was, it was odd. I mean, compared to, the last UN meeting was the the one where he called Kim Jong-un Rocket Man and started talking about fire and fury. I think that was 2 years ago, maybe. No, I guess it would have been last year.
Last year.
Yeah, yes, it wasn't president 2 years ago. So, time.
It feels like 2 years ago.
Yeah, it was a little more languid. He kind of hit all the greatest hits about Iran and, the world as he sees it. I didn't think there were too many surprises. I thought, I think in a sense you're right. I think it was a little languid. It's like his heart wasn't entirely in it.
Exhausted.
Yeah,
I thought exhausted.
Yeah, just not a super memorable speech. And then there's what he says, and then there's what they do. Nikki Haley was at lunch today with prime ministers of Poland and Latvia and Ukraine and other states that are very worried about the Putin regime in Moscow. And, she's sending kind of reassuring signals to them at the same time. The same countries worry about where he stands versus Russia. So, there's the government and then there's Trump.
Well, yeah, you could put it that way, I suspect. But, I think the thing about it is it was such a moment of disrespect for the President of the United States. That's no small thing.
No. I mean, it won't go down with, Nikita Khrushchev banging his shoe.
No, but it's different. It's in one way, it may be even worse. It's embarrassing. I was embarrassed. I thought he handled it.
It is embarrassing. I mean, you think about the respect the U.S. has commanded at various times. Obviously the U.S. instrumental in creating the United Nations. It's based in New York for a reason. And, it's very, it's disconcerting.
Yeah, it's
but on the other hand, given where John Bolton was, is probably the most despised UN ambassador ever by the UN, could have been worse.
I guess. But against that backdrop, and against falling poll numbers and all the other stuff, we get to the next two huge stories of the week. I want to begin with the Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, or Stein. I think he prefers Stein. What a story that is of what happened yesterday. I mean, I never saw reporters so screwed up and so confused as to what was true and what wasn't. And let me set it up for our listeners and just say, you understand that Rosenstein got in because he was appointed to replace James Comey, who Trump fired, and then lo and behold, that was what got the appointment to Robert Mueller as a special counsel to conduct the investigation into Donald Trump. Knowing all of that, in case you didn't know it. And we could go into details on that. But here he was, and then, first we hear, Rosenstein gave his resignation letter, and then, no, he didn't, and then he's on the way to the White House. No, he's not. Yes, he is. He goes into the White House. He comes out. He actually does a photo op. An unusual thing, as I'm sure, Matt, you will tell the audience, that a White House chief of staff would come outside. So, that messaging thing where, and he was not fired. And now Trump comes out and says Thursday, maybe at the same time, by the way, as the Kavanaugh hearings, he will speak to Mr. Rosenstein. Talk to me.
Well,
Jeez.
I don't want to sound mansplaining or Matt-splaining, but just a little difference on the sequence of how it happened. Remember, Sally Yates was the number 2 at Russia, at the Justice Department. She quit in a contretemps after overhearing the National Security Advisor of the United States
That's true, right?
Say things that were contradictory to what he had told the FBI in a wiretap. She got upset. She resigned. They had to find a new number 2. The first guy didn't work out. They eventually put in Rosenstein. Sessions recuses himself from the Russia investigation, so then it goes to Rosenstein. Anyway, no matter how you slice it, it's crazy. Look, I think it's pretty clear. Obviously, Trump doesn't like Sessions. He doesn't like Rosenstein. He wants them to be, political lapdogs. They're not. He's almost certainly going to try to get rid of Sessions when the election's over. I would probably Rosenstein too. But, he can't really do it right now. It's just too unsettling before the election.
Yeah, explain what it would mean if
it would be seen, while the president has the perfect prerogative to have a new number 2 at the Justice Department, although there's some limits depending on whether the guy resigns or is fired in terms of what he can do about a reappointment. Basically, it would be seen as a takeover of the Mueller investigation. Rosenstein is who Mueller reports to. for his investigation. And right now he's seen as an independent hand who's going to who chose Mueller and who worked with Mueller for many years, because Rosenstein was a long-time career Justice Department official, a longtime U.S. attorney for Baltimore, worked closely with Mueller when Mueller ran the criminal division and Mueller was head of the FBI. So they're very close, which drives Trump nuts. He's seen as giving Mueller a wide berth, and I think there will be real protests if he were to fire Rosenstein. People would see it as Trump corrupting justice, and there have been calls to put people on the streets if he fired him. So I don't think Trump's going to fire him. Even Sean Hannity was out there saying don't fire him.
Right.
But I think he gets to alpha dog it a little, because Rosenstein is quoted or is reported by the New York Times to have talked about invoking the 25th Amendment to potentially unseat the president. He's denied it vociferously. Other news organizations reported it somewhat differently, but nevertheless, Trump kind of has him in an apologetic state. And I think, like anyone, he's going to anyone who's a jerk, is going to kind of lord it over him, but not fire him. So
but here's the deal.
So that's why I think we're going to get Thursday.
All right, but the point being, he said Thursday. He didn't. Does anybody do PR better than Donald Trump? No. I mean, he did it also for that reason. I mean, he could have said Friday. He could have said Wednesday. He said no.
And they don't have to announce it. Yeah, I mean, sure.
Right. So
yeah, I think it takes some of the edge off Kavanaugh, and because they don't know how Kavanaugh's going to go, right? I mean, it could be really, horrible for the Republicans.
Aye.
It's likely not to be good for them. It's not what you want. It's not your ideal situation, but
what you think?
With the wife sitting behind him.
All right, wait, don't even go. Let me take you down the path, because this I don't know that I can. This is like the most horrible thing that I could think to be happening, and at the same time, it is the most fascinating thing to happen, and it is the saddest thing to be happening. I mean, this thing just it's everything. This is what people write great movies about and will one day. This Kavanaugh thing. Where do we begin? He's still here. I just want to say, Mr. Rosenstein or Rosenstein, which.
Yeah,
I'm busting you on you correcting me.
Right.
That last week, I said he would still be here, and he is still here. You didn't think that he would. I'm just going to gloat about that for a moment, because who knows?
No, you're right. You're right.
But who knows what comes in a second, honey? Because you know what, you and I could be finishing this, and it's all over. We don't know. This is the craziest thing that's happened in Washington in a very long time. So that's what I just wanted to give you a little kashrai about that. And if anybody doesn't know what that means, go look it up. It's a Yiddish word.
Yeah.
And that being said, I think we both have to agree he is deeply wounded. Yes?
Well, sure. I mean, instead of being on his way to being confirmed, he's nationally televised hearing about his, drinking and alleged sexual assault in high school. Yeah, that's probably not a great day for. You don't hear about like Elena Kagan going through this. Yeah.
No, right, exactly. I mean,
no one's talking about hauling Sam Alito up there and asking him what he drank in high school. It's pretty bad, but. I think everyone's made a calculate. Look, nobody wanted to shut this thing down, right? I mean, McConnell wasn't going to pull the nomination. Kavanaugh wasn't going to back down. Trump doesn't want to back down. The Republicans. I mean, everybody at this point, the base is riled up. They figure they might as well just, go to the casino table and see if maybe they come out.
Well, can I just make one statement that you'll probably shoot me for? Boys will be boys. If women were running this would not be playing the way that it is. I just want to make that point clear, because they went to the mat, and girls don't do it like that. They just don't. But here we are. Okay, we are.
I think there's something. I think there's something to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's foolish to be going.
I mean, we're going to have a number of Republican women senators vote for Kavanaugh. I mean, just to keep that in mind, that's going to happen.
That is going to happen. We're going to talk about that in a second.
They might all vote for Kavanaugh. Who knows? I'm not sure they will, but we know there's no sign that Capito or Fisher or some of the others are going to vote against him.
And that will be an issue as well. But here's the thing. Besides Blasey Ford, this other woman, Deborah Ramirez, came out, and this was this New York Magazine. It was New York Magazine, I think. And it was a Ronan Farrow. What's her name? The girl, I love her. She's
Jane Mayer.
Jane Mayer. She's something. And these two come out, and they're taking it on the chin. By the way, I don't think anybody, Democrats, has been kind to either of them to bring this Deborah Ramirez out. And as we were going to record, it comes out that she is not planning and would not plan at the moment to ever go in front of Congress. She just doesn't want any part of it, which then makes her suspect. But Lisa Murkowski thinks that she should testify. And I find that interesting. But I also find it interesting that her governor, who's an independent, and her lieutenant governor, I think it is, both said that they are not going, that they wouldn't vote for Kavanaugh. So giving her a little leeway here. She right now.
I think she does have leeway.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting. It's always been, tell me if I'm wrong about this, Matt, that Colin, Murkowski's always been taking the step after Collins. She's always kind of given Collins, I'll make the choice. It looks like that may not be true in this case. It looks like Lisa.
Oh, I think you're onto something. And, politically, Murkowski was elected as an independent. She lost her Republican primary.
Right.
Though she's from one of the old Republican families of Alaska, her father was governor and senator. But she got rejected by the right wing, and she had run as an independent, and she won. Now Alaska's still a very conservative state, but it's got signs of thaw, so to speak. It's got this independent governor and lieutenant governor. Meanwhile, in Maine, you got a very conservative governor, Paul LePage, coming to the end of his second term. I think Collins, in a way, is in a harder position politically. If she votes against Kavanaugh, I think it will cement the likelihood of a challenge against her and make it very hard for her to run for governor if she wants to do that or keep her Senate seat. I think she's, in a way, got less political room than Murkowski does. So what does that mean? I don't know. I think, we got other Republicans who are showing some hints, Flake, Corker.
I got a list, baby, of 8. Want to hear my list?
Yeah, give me your list.
Here's my list. Wait a minute, let me get to my list. I wrote it down so I could tell you my list. Yeah. Okay, the list is, of course, Murkowski, Jeff Flake. Yeah. Bob Corker, Susan Collins, Mike Enzi from Wyoming. Enzi. This is from Republican friends of mine. James Lankford, Jerry Moran from Kansas, and Ben Sass.
Well, I think Sass is an interesting one here because his research is all about adolescence.
Right.
And that's his. And I have a feeling he's been a little quiet here this week. And, I think...
Interesting, right?
I think, and I think it looks like all the Dems are going to vote against Kavanaugh.
Hopefully.
I think that's the case. I think they'll have plenty of places to hang their hat now. So, we'll just see what the world looks like after Thursday morning. We'll see how the public reacts. I mean, remember, it's now sort of assumed that, it's now become legend that, everyone was shocked about Anita Hill at the time, but Tom's ratings stayed pretty high throughout that, and he got through it in part because public opinion was with him at the time. Now it's since turned against him. So, we just don't know how it's going to read after the hearing. And if he goes down, hey.
Well, if he goes down, that's going to have huge, or at least that what they're afraid of is the huge impact on the midterms. I mean, they banked everything on Trump because of the court. If he can't pull the court off, because he hasn't done a lot of other stuff, including the wall.
I think there's no question it's likely to have it.
I mean, that's why he's playing the game that he's playing. Because under any other circumstance, anybody would have dropped this guy in a boom. That would have been the end of it. They didn't do that. I want to digress for 1 second, and then I'll get back to Kavanaugh because we're not finished with Kavanaugh, folks. I promise. Michael Avenatti. This guy is. Jesus, I mean, you got to give the guy credit. I mean, he out of nowhere into, oh my God. He's an ambulance chaser. He couldn't be more sleazy, in my opinion, than he is. Yeah. But he has been producing. But today was weird. So now he's been talking about he's got this great, client, maybe 2 or 3. He's, the woman apparently is credentialed, is passed every, FBI background check that there is to check, worked in great parts of the government. And then he went silent today. Yeah. And then he actually locked his Twitter feed because he said he was getting hounded. And then the right went after him like I've never seen the right go after him, just saying, this guy is just full of, gaga doo-doo. And he did tweet before we were going on air, he's still waiting. It's 36 hours, not 48. What are your thoughts?
Well, he's such an avowed partisan and such a street fighter. I think he does not make it easier for Susan Collins and Murkowski to vote against Kavanaugh. I don't think he's helping. I'm not sure he's helping the cause here. What's a third? I mean, we'll see what these women say, but I'm not sure if a third woman would really turn the tide in a way that the first two haven't.
Except to say this, two things. One is if he has something really specific, which they don't have. It's more than hearsay, but maybe there's something. There's that. She might be more of an insider that people may be surprised to maybe know.
No question. No, there's no question.
Something there.
It could be powerful evidence.
Yeah.
I'm just saying his presence. It was brought forward by, some other lawyer.
Well, yeah, but he's the one lately who's getting the goods. And so it just makes me curious. I stand by this. He has not failed yet. It'd be interesting if he fails now. Well,
you are absolutely right. I underestimated his whole stormy ploy.
Yeah, right. Right.
This turned out to be a brilliant maneuver.
Right. So let's see what happens. But it had to be brought up because I do think
I think that's what we could all be talking about by Thursday.
I think that's true.
And let's see if everybody gets to the hearing on Thursday. I think so. But,
I don't know. That brings up the next thing. So now they have this mystery person coming into the hearings, the Republicans, this woman.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Mystery. They're keeping her a mystery, which I am infuriated about. Let me tell you why. What's fair about that? First of all, I think they're idiots because they really are looking like, I'm going to say the word, ballless. Because they got derided a little bit because they're 11 white old men.
Yeah, right.
Whatever. And you know what? But those 11 white old men are elected officials. Yeah. And not since 1975, I think it is, has anybody been brought in to man a hearing, in this case woman a hearing. I just don't think it's fair to Dr. Ford and her team to say we're not going to tell you who it is or what's going to happen and just intimidate the hell out of her, which what it is. It's an intimidating move. There was talk today, I don't know if you picked it up, that she is hesitant to go to the hearing and participate. Now I said Ford. I said along the way, if I were them and I was doing the PR, this is before they got as far as they got, but almost before they got us where they got, that if I were them, I would not have gone. I would have called every news organization in, and I would have run a concurrent hearing. Who do you think the press was going to pick up on? It wasn't going to be Kavanaugh. They were going to go with her, and she has a simultaneous hearing. Rather than have them doing the questioning, have her own people doing the questioning. Yeah. I think that would have been brilliant. And it may just be that's where they end up, by the way.
I've given up trying to really predict where this goes. It used to be common to use committee counsel or outside lawyers to do a lot of the questioning at hearings. You remember Iran-Contra, they brought in a couple of...
Right, but not on something like this.
Not on something like this, no. Yeah.
Right, and this is the first time, as I said, I think...
Well, and I assume this person has to sort of, think about their own future. I mean, do they want to seem overly prosecutorial? That sort of defeats the whole point of bringing the person in who's supposed to give it a bit of a light touch.
Yeah, I'm doing a show in a couple of weeks about women. That's going to be really interesting. The way women are, the difference in women in the Republican Party versus the Democratic Party, West Coast women versus East Coast women, how we all deal with all of this, the schism amongst women. This is touchy territory, and they may be making more of a and I play with all my Republican women friends on Facebook and Twitter, and my Democratic friends. But you hear what I'm saying. This is dicey stuff. It sounds like men are trying to blow women up. That's their solution to the problem and take the onus off of Kavanaugh. That's a ploy.
Yeah, I mean it's clearly a frightened thing, and it's interesting. I don't think they have a lot of women prosecutors in the Republican conference in the U.S. Senate. In other words, the Dems have a lot, like Kamala Harris was a prosecutor, Maestro Cortez from Nevada was a prosecutor. A lot of them were lawyers.
Well,
Klobuchar was a prosecutor. But the ones they have are not prosecutors, as I sort of
well, I didn't get the feeling it was, this is not somebody from inside. This is somebody they're bringing from the outside in. Right. And you're saying because of that's why they
I mean, they can't throw it to another senator. They gotta go out and they get sort of, I don't know, presumably a former prosecutor of, Victoria Tenzing type.
Oh, God, I hope it's not her.
Somebody.
Or what's her name from Fox now?
Oh, yes. Yeah, but then Judge Jeanine.
Yeah.
Pam Bondi.
Oh, my God. She's one of us down here.
Put in President Bondi.
Oh, no. All right, next, I'm going to get sick. I don't want to discuss it. Let's go to last night. Let's go to that bizarre, and you and I are going to have a different point of view on Kavanaugh and the missus showing up on Fox News to be interviewed by Martha MacCallum. And I'm just going to say, you're an insider. I am not, but I'm going to say this. No. Let's not forget that she was one of Roger Ailes' staunch defenders. Bad choice for women. Bad choice. Now, you think she's a bona fide great journalist. I wouldn't even say that.
I think you're misreading something I tweeted.
Okay, talk to me.
Well, I don't know Martha MacCallum personally. I think I was on one of her shows once. But, I mean, she's she came from CNBC. She's very good friends with Stephen Colbert. They live near each other in New Jersey, and the families are close. I mean, she's not known as like a super Fox partisan. And I think with the Ailes, I think like Greta Van Susteren and some other women and men there, they initially were, said they were shocked by the accusations, and they said things that were very defensive about Ailes that they later backed off from. Look,
you have to ask why. You have to ask why. I mean,
I can't gauge her moral character or her political inclinations entirely well, but I thought she did, kind of the bare minimum on pressing him last night. It was not all softballs. I mean, she did adequate. I don't think he helped himself any. It was no checkers speech, I mean, it was not one of those gambits that won hearts and minds. He looked like he was, being POW behind bars or something, trying to blink his answers. I mean,
oh my God, it was. I mean, bizarre.
It was really embarrassing.
It was.
I mean, look at the transcript. It's like a crazy person. And the poor wife has to sit there. And, I thought it was painful for everybody. I don't think he helped himself.
No, I don't think he helped himself either. In fact, I think he actually...
but I don't think MacCallum really embarrassed herself. I don't think she embarrassed herself.
She was in a horrible position. She put her...
it was not a Fox and Friends interview. It was not like that.
No, but I think that I would have said no if I were at Fox. But we have to talk about the fact that first he went to Fox, that a candidate for the Supreme Court, who in his opening statement said something along the lines of, we must not be partisan, we must be fair, we must whatever, and then he goes to Fox. Okay, so that was pretty stinky, and that wasn't his idea. That was probably, what's his name from Fox, who's now working for Bill Shine.
I'm sure it was his too.
Okay,
I mean, look.
So, they're all trying to save his butt, but it was bad. Two things that I wanted to ask you about, or at least discuss with you, and that is, the one is, he actually wound up muzzling his wife the same way maybe he muzzled young Dr. Ford when MacCallum asked Mrs. Kavanaugh a question that he didn't want her to ask. I think it was about whether they should bring the FBI in, and he just ran with it. He just made me so mad at that moment. But something you'll appreciate about this, I couldn't help myself. I went back to when Bill and Hillary did their 60-minute interview.
Sure.
When she said, I'm not sitting here with some little woman standing by my man like Tammy Wynette. Go back to look at that. During that whole thing, Bill was sitting there looking at Hillary with such pride. Pride. You could see it in his eyes. I'm not going to say he was looking at her with love in his heart or lust, but he was certainly looking. And in this interview, it was the other way around. This is 2018, and she was sitting there looking at him, the little woman. Difference between Democrats and Republicans. I'm telling you, that's the tabloid or the tabloid.
Yeah. Well, right. And also Clinton had conceded problems in his marriage. He was denying Jennifer Flowers, but he wasn't saying I'm a choir boy.
No, I understand that.
Whereas Kavanaugh he was like, I've never even heard of such a thing. Drinking at parties or...
Here's the point, though. Matt, he lied. And he's going to have to lie on the witness stand on Thursday because his yearbooks clearly say, in his own words, I drank. His friends came, his college roommate came out 5 seconds later and said, oh, my God, the guy drank. He would drink himself into a coma. I mean, here's the deal. Kavanaugh is lying. And there is no way about it. Whether he lies, whether she did it or he didn't do it, he has now lied. Now, isn't that something? Does it matter anymore?
It should. I mean, I don't think he's totally, to be fair, I don't think he's totally denied drinking.
He did. He said during that interview that
he said, I never drank.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I didn't do any of that. I didn't drink. I didn't. I was a virgin. Like that made any difference? I mean, nobody charged him with penetration.
God.
Well, I mean, here's what he did. And lies come in many forms. You can say them, outright, or you can intimate, and however you parse it. He was not telling the truth last night, and he's been by many people now told, no, this isn't true. This is who this guy was. You got to look at his Wikipedia page today, which was changed, by the way, on the 25th. It, too, gives a different, it says, Kavanaugh went to Yale University and majored in history. Serious. He was serious but not showy student who loves sports, especially basketball. Updated September 25th. I wonder by whom. Right. This annoys me. It annoys me that he is now crossed over on the issue of going to making this a partisan issue and playing the partisan role, et cetera, et cetera. And the other stuff we're going to find out about. We'll see how believable she is. But you see what I'm...
I agree. I mean, yeah. I mean, he's been really... He's been really cagey. He's been really diminished by this process. I mean, he was one of the, New York Times had a straight day about all these boys in his class who said that they had, put lines in their yearbook about dating some woman or having had conquest with some woman in their class. It's very ugly.
So who do you think is winning this right now? Do you think the Dems or the Republicans?
Well, the Dems, because he's not confirmed yet. I mean, the Dems, because this is, sapping, taking up so much oxygen before the election.
You think they're outplaying?
Yeah, I mean they've had a lot to work with. I don't know if they've handled it with any great aplomb. I mean, it was kind of,
All right, so you're giving it to them up to this point where we are. Anything else you want to say that's like, in your brain about this whole thing before we move to the last?
No, let's. I'm just. It'll be wrong and outdated. Anything I say, because it's just some other crazy thing will happen.
All right.
Trump will invade Quebec. Martians will land. Something else will happen. So who knows?
You're such a character, and you're probably right. I am waiting for that. All right, let's just go real quick to the Florida race again, because this is really getting to be interesting. Nelson pulling ahead of Rick Scott. According to the Quinnipiac poll, I just want to read this to you. It was conducted the 20th to 24th. Nelson polled particularly well among women, which is interesting, leading Scott 58 to 41. Men favor Scott 51 to 47%. Nelson is ahead 53 to 46 by doing a tad better than Governor Scott with their respective bases and holding a 16-point lead among the key independent voting bloc. Let's see. I wanted to read a couple of things. Nelson's breaking even among men, the traditional path to a Democratic victory. 94% said, by the way, they've already made up their minds.
Yeah.
Okay, but he's losing, interestingly enough, in the Hispanic vote by a lot. That's kind of interesting. In Florida, Trump approval rate is 44-54. And I also want to throw in that Gillum, you guys, because you keep tweeting to me about this, he's up by 5. Last week it was 6. He's holding his own. Yeah. So what do you think of there? I mean, this to me is bellwether, and this to me is happening across the country in places nobody thought the Senate was winnable.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think Trump's unpopularity is hurting. Gillum's a good, energetic candidate. Scott's made a lot of enemies. Nelson's slow and steady.
Yeah,
he's like the tortoise. He's like the tortoise. The tortoise was an astronaut.
That's true. He'll
just kind of mosey over the finish line.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to see what happens here.
He's a little hard. He's one of those guys. It's hard for them to tear him down. He's a crazy liberal. What are you going to say about Nelson? Everybody knows him.
But Scott is, by the way, throwing about the far left. Every other sentence out of his mouth is the far left.
I'm sure that tests to get his people to show up.
Exactly, because you can't go there with Nelson. No way.
But that's a tough sell with Nelson.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree.
And this DeSantis guy. It's like there's a new, a
villain
turd in the well every time you look.
He's a villain.
Yeah. I don't know. And he's really went all in with Trump in a way that was just,
stupid,
kind of unbelievable.
And Trump bailed out on him right away, immediately, and he keeps saying, "Well, we're still friends." That's what he says on the stump. We're still friends. We're just, whatever. It's a fascinating race. It's not quite as good as watching what's going to happen on Thursday, to say the least. Now, so I close on this, and I am going to put you. I'll put my take. You put yours. Does Dr. Ford show up at the hearing, or does she not? Does the hearing take place?
Right now, I'll say yes. Sure, it's what, Tuesday night when we're recording.
Yeah,
can
Tuesday.
I say that?
You can say it's Tuesday night.
It's Tuesday night. We got less than 48 hours. They both said they're going to be there. I don't see what's going to change it. Okay. Who's going to back out? She's going to just not show up now because she doesn't like the person who's doing the questioning. I think she's going. I know he wants to go. So, I say it happens.
Okay. I say that she is going to, I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to say it on air. She's going to dick around with him. Yes, I am. No, I'm not. Yes, I am. No, I'm not. She's going to taunt him until he can't stand it, and then she'll show. That's my guess. But we could both be wrong, so we're agreed on that.
Okay, but you're still saying she shows up.
I'm still saying she shows up. I'm just saying that she's going to torture him till he doesn't know which end is up, because he has no chance of winning this if she doesn't, by the way. He can't stay in if she doesn't.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think you're right, but if she doesn't show after all this, I'm not totally sure that's good for her.
Well, I think what she would do is she would have an alternate hearing, which is what most women want her to do anyway, by the way. That's the position of most women. They don't want her to have to do, to go into that den like women have been forced to do so many times.
Right.
In an unequal setting. So most women actually don't want her to go. Most women prefer, I haven't read anything other than from the powerful women that I know, all saying the same thing. Let her hold a concurrent hearing.
Don't go. Yeah.
Right. But have the hearing, just to have it on your terms, not theirs. So we'll see.
On the other hand, you go in there, and if they look, unfair or, like they're trying to crucify her, it's going to...
Right. Well, I think they're going to try their damnedest
not to. I think they're going to couch it in gentle language.
Right. Well, they're going to try, but I don't think that they can help themselves. I just think that's the nature of who Republicans are. They're mean people. I do want to say one thing about him as we close, and that is this. The more I see him, the less I like him. This guy does not have good charisma. He doesn't. And that's going to hurt him.
Yeah, I think he's not wearing. Yeah, I think that's right.
He doesn't wear well.
That was not a great performance, as you said on TV. Not even looking at your wife.
And so we leave it there, darling. I've been speaking with journalist Matthew Cooper. You can read his insightful reporting at Washingtonian.com and follow him on Twitter at @MattIsCoop and on Facebook at Matthew Cooper. You're You are listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. My guest today is veteran White House correspondent and contributing editor to Washingtonian magazine, Matthew Cooper, my co-host on Podcast America, and distinguished cultural psychologist, Michele Gelfand, the author of the new book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show posts new podcasts Wednesdays 3 p.m. Eastern at hallicasserjayne.com and is available wherever you listen to your podcasts. Be sure to find me on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, on all your favorite apps. You can find the Halli Casser-Jayne Show on your Alexa device, too. Just say, the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Oh, and come play with me on Twitter at the Halli CJ Show. In a provocative new book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire Our World, celebrated cultural psychologist Michele Gelfand shows that much of the diversity in the way we as a people think and act derives from a simple difference: tight, rigid social norms versus loose, weak social norms. Sensing threats, tight cultures, whether large nations or small, close-knit groups, even political parties, insist on social order. Feeling safe, loose cultures promote individual expression, sometimes to excess. Is this the source of America's great political divide? A distinguished professor at the University of Maryland College Park, Gelfand used field, experimental, computational, and neuroscience methods to understand the evolution of culture, as well as its multi-level consequences for human groups. Her work has been cited over 20,000 times and has been featured in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, National Public Radio, Voice of America, Fox News, NBC News, ABC News, The Economist, among other outlets. In an era that is more divided than ever, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers offers a startling new lens through which we can see exactly why others stake out the positions they do, and with that new perspective, reap for the first time the benefits other cultures have to offer. Let's talk with Michele Gelfand. All right, so some of us are rule makers and some of us are rule breakers. So, well, that just explains it, right? So simple. But it's not, is it? Michele, define premise for us. This is really interesting stuff. How did you come about all of this? How'd you get there? What's the conclusion? And then we'll go into the weeds when you're done.
Okay, you got it. I mean, I think, really the purpose of this book is to try to give people a new lens with which to see the world, from diplomats to CEOs, from parents to policymakers, and even curious people watchers. Often it's the case we don't really understand what's driving our behavior, and the book is trying to give a new framework, what I call tightness and looseness, to understand the world around us and even ourselves and how it's affecting our decisions.
That's it.
Yeah.
All right, we did all of that. No, it's wonderful.
There you go. That's it in a nutshell.
Well, I love the fact that it's so easily defined and so well defined that it's and it can be put into a sentence that makes sense. So much of our diversity does not make sense, and the way we think and act derives from that key difference. This is where you arrive. How tightly or loosely we adhere to social norms. How? I mean, how do we get to tightly? How do we get to loosely? How do we get to who we are? Yeah.
Well, first of all, just going to step back and say that, what's so fascinating to me is how much all of us are following rules from the moment we wake up into the moment we go to bed. We can't survive as humans without rules, and without even knowing it, we're just following them. We say hello and goodbye when we answer the phone. We drive on the right or the left side of the road, depending where we live. We don't sort of face the back in elevators. I try to do that sometimes just to see people's reactions. We don't have sex in movie theaters. We're abiding by rules all the time, and they're so omnipresent, but they're invisible. So I was really curious about this distinction of social norms and how some groups evolve to be tight. They more strongly adhere to rules and punish people who don't comply, and others are much more loose. They're rule breakers. They're more permissive. And I've been studying this distinction across hundreds of societies, from the ancient Aztecs to Alabama, from Silicon Valley to the military, to see whether we can understand some kind of common logic about tight and loose. And that's really what the book is about. And it's based on my research that I've been doing over the last couple of decades.
What got you started on this? I mean, there's a clue here as to what made you think this concept.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating. I started observing in my travels around the world as a cross-cultural psychologist, studying human behavior around the world, some distinctions that really didn't make much sense. You know, why is it that you can't bring large quantities of gum into Singapore and where you can be fined for many things? They call it the fine city, whereas you take a short plane right over to New Zealand and people are walking barefoot in banks and there's huge fences full of bras. And, you know, why is it that you can get the death penalty for smoking marijuana in some countries, like in Indonesia, but you can smoke it openly in the Netherlands or even in some U.S. states? And I started realizing that, you know, this kind of notion of strict versus permissive seems to be something that we can understand the world through. Just like as individuals, we have certain personalities. You know, we talk about this as the big five in psychology, like extroversion or neuroticism or conscientiousness. We can also start thinking about how do groups vary. And because norms are so fundamental to us to survive, it struck me as an important metric on which groups vary. And that's what I set out to study. What's the reason why groups evolve to be tight and loose? And what are the consequences? What are the trade-offs of living in a tight and loose culture from nations to our households? And so that's really what I'm excited to tell, you know, everyone about is how I've been studying this and what the logic is surrounding tight and loose.
And I love the fact that you say from country, from nations to country, to state, to city, to town, family systems. Is it also in our DNA?
You know, we haven't studied that, but it certainly is inbrained. We've been using some neuroscience techniques to look at how the brain reacts to the perception of norm violators. And it's really striking to see that in our example in the U.S. and China, how different the brain is wired to process those norm violations. You know, one of the biggest predictors of tightness is how threatened a group is. At the national level, that can be how many invasions have you had over the course of your history? How many disasters do you have to face from Mother Nature? China has faced far more threats in its history than the United States, and strong rules, tightness evolved to help people coordinate to survive in those contexts. And we can see that using fMRI techniques and EEG techniques that the brain is wired more strongly in China to process these violations in the service of coordinating in the face of a lot of threat. And that also, by the way, applies to the state level. At the state level, we see that the tight states have more threat. When we look at social class, we could see that the working class experiences far more threat, both in terms of avoiding hard living and poverty to the occupations that are more dangerous. And in some households, people, you know, have their own tight, loose mindset and that have evolved. You know, individuals can be placed on a continuum also, and a lot of it has to do with our socialization and the amount of threat we experienced, and sometimes it has to be negotiated with your spouse, with your kids. So I have one chapter where I talk about, you know, how do you kind of manage tight, loose in your own household?
So, but it gets me to this. Does it just stand there? You are either, no. I mean, it's serious. Are you either a rule breaker or a rule maker? Or are you either loose or not? Or is it flexible? You can change at any given moment or to any specific thing.
This is such a great question. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, actually, when you think about going through your day, you're sort of constantly navigating the strengths of norms effortlessly. Like when you go to a library, you don't start singing and drinking vodka. You know, when you go to a party or you're in a public park, you know, you can kind of relax more and be a little looser. So we're actually really naturally calibrated to our environments that require stronger or weaker mindsets when it comes to tight loose. But each of us has a default that we have, again, that we're sort of more comfortable in, whether we're breaking rules or making rules. But as I mentioned, like, it does change. It depends on the situation we're in. It depends on, especially at the group level, it depends on how much threat we're experiencing. After 9/11, you know, we tightened up as a nation because it's a fundamental instinct to want strong rules and strong leaders when we're facing threat to coordinate. But, you know, as threats disappear or as they get reduced, we tend to go back to our natural state. In the U.S., that tends to be somewhat loose depending on what state you're living in. So we do see that. We can activate threat in the laboratory, tell people that there's some kind of fake threat that they don't know about, and it tightens people's minds, you know, very, very quickly. It doesn't last very long if the threat's not real, but it still can be very malleable.
Is it so scientific that it can be predictive? let's say in elections, or who will war with whom, or how can we predetermine a leader's actions or a people's response? Is it that predictive?
Yeah, this is so interesting, and we tried to set out to see if we could predict, for example, who would support Trump and who would support Hillary before the election. And same in France, who would support Le Pen versus other people on the ballot. And our hunch was that we could predict it, that we measured people's feelings of threats. How important is it that, you feel that we have to be ready to fight ISIS? And how scared are you about North Korea? How scared are you about various threats? And we measured this. And it was really interesting. People who felt a lot of threat felt the U.S. was too loose. And this, in turn, predicted their support for Trump. And the same exact dynamic in France. And so I think it's really important to think about what's happening around the world in terms of the rise of different leaders that are surprising to people. It's not so surprising from a cultural psychology perspective, because when people feel threat, they really want strong rules and strong autocratic leaders to help lead the way. Whether or not those threats are objective or exaggerated is a real question. And so that's something I think we can talk more about. But it does help us to understand that the rise of these leaders is not something based on some ideological factor per se. It's not based on some mesmerizing personality. It has a lot to do with how threatened we feel and who we think can help us survive those threats.
So you're saying emotion rules the day when we're all told you better get into your heads and stop letting emotion make your choices for you throughout life. I mean, but it is, right?
Yeah, I think that the rational voter, psychology has been in business for many years to show that, even though we like to think we're really rational and we make rational decisions, that we are guided a lot by our emotions. I think when it comes to threat and tightness, we haven't quite recognized this dynamic, and it's happening all over the place. I'll give you another example that's pretty surprising from our research. Even something like the rise of ISIS, it's coming from a lot of reasons, of course. It's multiply determined. There's not one explanation. But tightness also has a lot to do with this phenomenon, too, because when ISIS was taking over certain areas and Mosul, these areas were totally disorganized. They were totally normless. They had a lot of security problems. The people craved order, and ISIS gave it to them. They came in and they started giving food services. They developed infrastructure. They helped resolve disputes. Of course, over time they evolved to be very tight and not fit the needs of the populace, which is why they fell. But even in these cases, when there is tremendous insecurity, people crave order, and they'll look to the people or the mechanisms that can help provide that. So I think it's a really important diagnostic tool. Like right now, we've been talking about how ISIS is dead. It's probably not dead, because unless those areas get more norms and more normative order, people will again seek out order in other ways.
Male-female component to this, particularly when you raise something like ISIS, because it's mostly men. And by the way, men in a way had a lot to do with Trump being elected. Men are under threat from the feminist movement, from all sorts of, from Hillary. Talk to me about that male-female component in all of this, because I think it must be very strong. Yeah,
you have such a great intuition. You're just like a cultural psychologist. I think it's a really interesting question, because we don't find that there's big differences among men and women around the world in terms of tight-loose. But reality is that people who have power have more latitude, and what that means is that people like white men tend to live in looser worlds. They get a lot more leeway for the same behavior. And women and minorities and people of other statuses, lower statuses, they live in tighter worlds. They're subject to stronger punishments. You could see this just recently in the Serena Williams case. I would love to do a study where we actually document how many times women and minorities are penalized in sporting events, because we've seen in our other research that in both among field studies and lab studies that women and minorities get judged more harshly for breaking the rules. And we haven't looked at that in sports context, but I would bet some money that we'd find that. From an N of one, I see it a lot with my kids who are playing sports. But that just suggests that, we can take this lens and zoom in and see who's living in a tighter, looser world. And like you said, it's also, you can flip it to say, sometimes when men feel threatened, they also yearning for stronger rules and for people to help to return to a traditional order, which is what drove a lot of the vote for Trump.
Yeah, I think so. There's some fun things in here, like, for instance, clocks in Germany are accurate while those in Brazil are frequently wrong.
These crazy studies psychologists do.
I mean, you guys are crazy, and I love it, but it's true, I mean, it's true, but you can look at the character of the two countries, and the kind of people who live there, and certainly what happened in Germany, and Brazil is, could it be more fun and more crazy, and who cares about time? I mean, these are things that I love about, all of this. You got anything to say on that?
We've always trying to find sources of data that are, some surveys, some unobtrusive observations, and that study of clocks was done actually by a psychologist by the name of Levine, and we connected his data on clocks and city streets to the tightness data that we have. And basically, if you walk around cities in Germany, for example, a lot of the clocks say pretty much the same time. But if you go to, like, Greece or Brazil, two loose cultures in our data, it's really hard to figure out what exactly is the time around here. And actually, you can think about clocks as a coordination mechanism. Tight cultures have more mechanism to coordinate. Actually, remarkably, the stock markets are more synchronized in tight cultures also. Some research came out of management departments, some finance professors a couple of years ago that showed that in tight cultures, the stock market is more tightly coupled in terms of buying and selling stocks. And so synchrony is really important. We all synchronize our actions, but it's much stronger in tight cultures. There's more order. There's less crime in tight cultures. There's more monitoring. When we send our RAs around the world, they note how many security cameras there are or how many police there are. And there's just many more people watching you in these cultures. And when you're watched, you behave well. Watch people are good people, in many ways. But the flip side, and, loose cultures and loose states tend to be more disorganized. And they suffer from more, like, self-regulation failures, more debt, more obesity. But the flip side is that loose cultures have more openness. They're much more open to different people, to stigmatize people. They're more open to new ideas. They're more creative, and they're more open to change. And another crazy experiment we did that I talk about in the book, I sent around my RAs around the world, research assistants, and I bought them some warts to put on their face. You could purchase warts if you want, and also in sometimes I had them wearing, like, really some tattoos all over their face and their neck and some nose earrings, and in other cases they just wore their normal face. And I had them just go around city streets and ask for directions, and also go into stores and ask for help. And it was really interesting. Here's where you see, the strength of loose cultures. There was much more openness to people with these stigmatized identities in loose cultures. They got far more help than it did in tight cultures. So there's this interesting trade-off between order and openness. And you can find that in, from nations to states to organizations that are tight or loose, and even in households. So I think it's that what I've been trying to find at every level of analysis to study this, and we could see the same pattern.
What about age? Because, they say that people get more rigid as they get older. Democrats turn into Republicans, and I think that's another conversation. You might want to address that, because are Democrats rule breakers and rule makers or Republicans? I mean, talk to me.
I mean, it's interesting. We haven't done a lot of research on this, but my speculation would be there's a theory in psychology that shows that as you get older and you feel more threatened by death, that you do kind of hold on to your cultural values more, and so it might be that we find some interesting kinds of effects where people who are in loose cultures become looser as they age, and tight cultures become tighter. But I'm not sure. I mean, it's also possible that as you get older, it's clearly the youth, you're more experimental. And actually, every generation of people have said, these kids these days, even Plato was known to say, the kids these days, they're so misbehaved.
Right.
So it's possible, that there's some kind of interesting nonlinear dynamics that happen. But it's also very contextual. Like in Japan, I've been told that it's a very tight culture. It has a lot of threat, that natural disasters, population density is really high, invasions, et cetera, conflict. But I've been told that there's certain times in your life that you sort of release from that normative pressure. When you go to college, like it's kind of anything goes until you go back into the workforce. So it's important, I think, even when we think about countries or states or organizations, that there are always some pockets or time periods where people loosen up or tighten up. And sometimes we can predict that and, and sort of make sense of it. And I think it's helpful when you're traveling to know what those domains are that evolve to be tight or loose in any country.
I think that's true. Yeah. Can you save people from a bad marriage? Should a rule breaker marry? Should a combustible rule breaker make her a rule breaker?
I think it's fascinating. I mean, I've been married for 20-something years, and I should know exactly how long, but I forgot. But in any event, it's so fascinating because when you get married, people are naturally veering tight or loose on this continuum. There's a default that we have, and we don't often realize that, we might have some conflict that comes from these differences if we have them. Especially when it comes to things like finances. Like I've had a lot of people talk to me about the stories that I write about in the book that say, their spouse is so much tighter to them on finances. Or another biggie is parenting. Like how tight or loose are you in parenting? And some people, based on their own socialization or their occupation or their class or generational status, they veer tight and they want to tighten up in many domains when their kids are teenagers, which is pretty threatening. I could speak for myself. But, these are things that once we sort of recognize that we have to think about what domains are tight or loose in the household, we can negotiate them. And I do that even directly with my kids. I mean, the poor thing is no tight, loose, backwards and forwards, because they hear about it all the time. But I can say, these domains have to be tight, and these domains can be loose. And then we can have more shared understanding about how we're sort of using norms in our everyday environment.
The thing that I think is important to make here, I mean, particularly in the craziness that we're all living in, where politics is everything. There is nothing else right now. There's just that. Is there a judgment factor to rule breaker versus rule maker? Should we be judging, or are they just different continuums on sides to the coin in a sense? I know me personally, I have no patience at all for rule.
For real makers.
I'm just, oh my God. So I'm curious about that.
I think that I think what we have to recognize are two things. One is that each has advantages and disadvantages. I mean, order is great. Openness is great. And we have these differences in many ways because of good reasons, based on threat, based on our experiences. So once we sort of step back and say, okay, now I understand why this person or, this context annoys me so much, but we can have more empathy when we know that it arises to some extent for a reason. For example, I think it's really important, in this sort of national, climate that we start really reaching out to understanding voters who voted for Trump. Like what really was causing that vote? Once we recognize that, well, some of it really has to do with threat, then we can try to sort of say, look, we can understand this. We might not agree with it, but we can understand it. And today I have an article that came out in Time magazine that I said we need to really stop stereotyping each other. Like that's another key issue is that once you start really talking to someone, whether it's another immigrant or whether it's someone across the aisle, on the political spectrum, you start realizing wow, we have far more similarities than we do have differences. And sometimes what's happening is that we have these extreme stereotypes that we're boxing, in this fantasy land. Whereas once we really start thinking about and talking with people who are different, they feel less threatening to us, and that helps open up a lot of dialogue. And I think that's a really important thing that we need to be doing more often.
One of the things that came to mind to me was, we have two expressions that I think kind of say it. And I love the fact that you bring up empathy, because in the middle of all is the entire lack of it on everybody's part. It's going the wayside. But we say uptight, but then we say loosey-goosey.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, that's right.
It's judgmental. It's baked into the cake, as the famous saying of the day goes.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, again, understanding where these differences come from helps. I think having real interactions where we can actually test our assumptions about people help. We did this in a study recently where we had Pakistanis and Americans reading each other's diaries every day for 7 days. So we randomly assigned people in Pakistan and randomly assigned people in the U.S. to either read diaries from the other country or from their own country. And it was remarkable because when we started the study, people in Pakistan thought about Americans as being like overly loose, like half naked all the time, like calling the police on their parents, and vice versa. Like Americans really stereotype Pakistanis as not just tight, but like overly repressed. They didn't imagine them playing sports or singing. They just had these really just exaggerated stereotypes of each other. And it's no question that Pakistan's tighter than the United States. But once they read each other's diaries over the course of a week, it was remarkable to see the attitude change. They still said, look, we recognize our cultural differences, but we're so much more similar than we realized. And we saw a really big change in their attitudes over time.
Knowledge is power in all of this. And I think that's a lot of what's going on here. I think we don't have that. I think we're so polarized that even the writers these days are on their side of the court. We don't see the whole picture anymore, I don't think. I think we see a very black and white. There's no gray. There is no gray. No understanding. One thing that I do want to ask you very quickly, and that's, state of West Virginia, for instance, it's now a red state. It used to be a blue state, and overnight it turned. Mm-hmm. Same is true of Oklahoma. So as far as the change is concerned, that's what I want to talk to you. Can it change rapidly from one to the other? I think that's important in the context of our politics.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it's really important to recognize that the states that you mentioned, they're really facing tremendous amounts of disruption in the world. The globalization, has really affected people, especially in contexts where there's been a heavy reliance on manufacturing and coal. And, as a loose nation, we haven't actually done a good job of reaching out to people. Like in Germany, the working class, there's certificates that people have where they can go from different companies because they have a certificate, or they're in some contexts, even in the United States, we see areas that have been threatened by the manufacturing decline. You see that there's partnerships that develop between universities and government and locals. And I think we need to really deal more directly with the real threat that's happening in some of these states. But at the same time, I will mention that I think what's happening too is our leaders, also are like manufacturing and using the threat machine and targeting people who are very threatened. And there's no question that you can see that dynamic. I mean, you listen to rhetoric from Donald Trump and, everything's a disaster and we're on the brink of, a massive catastrophe. I mean, you just look at the language that is used. We're actually in the process of analyzing speeches and comparing them. I mean, and that's really activating threat. People are very sensitive to the fear of hearing about threats. And so when you have a combination of people who are actually threatened but then are being constantly fed this rhetoric of threat, it produces this cocktail, of these people getting elected, in my view. So I think, we have to be mindful that there is a real threat, but there's also a lot of illusory and exaggerated threat that's happening. Often it's the case, it's simply based on memory. You hear about an undocumented immigrant killing someone, this tragic case in Iowa, and then people start thinking, they misrepresent that this is not very common. Like, we don't think about that when a white guy murders people in Texas at a stadium. We don't generalize that to all, white men, just like we shouldn't be generalizing what happened in Iowa to, all immigrants, because this is just available heuristic, it's called in psychology. And I was really proud to hear the father of the slain woman, Molly, say, look, we've got to not stereotype this. It was such a point in our national conversation that's so important. I wrote about it today in the Time piece, that we need more people doing this and people reaching out across the aisle. There's some of the other examples I have in the piece in Time, and that, people are saying, let's talk to each other. Let's fight this fake threat. Let's really try to calibrate how threatened we are. I mean, I think obviously we have to be vigilant to threats. I say that, on the anniversary of 9/11 in particular, but I think also there's no question that we see so much threat that's exaggerated around the country.
I think two things that I would add to that. One is that I think some of us are more susceptible to fear than others, and we have to figure out why that is. And secondly, that if you take that, we have leaders who these days are playing to the lowest common denominator and preying on those fears. And we didn't. That wasn't ever how it was, and that's just politics of cynicism. And it really isn't it a shame?
Yeah.
Right. So
it's also the ironic thing also is that when we look at norms, I've started this conversation about how omnipresent they are and how invisible they are. We often don't even notice them until they're broken, and that's what we see a lot in the Trump presidency. We see that norms for civil behavior that we sort of took for granted in that office and in that institution are being broken all the time, and we're sort of aghast at the fact that that's happening, and so it just makes us realize how important norms are for our everyday behavior and for our country.
Yeah, it's a great barometer, and how wonderful. I hadn't even thought about that. I love that. That's brilliant. Two questions before we depart. One is, and I want to know, How do we use this in our individual lives to navigate our own lives using this tool? Because I think that's brilliant and it's important.
Thanks so much. I mean, I think that the language, even just starting to look around you and look at our own behavior through the lens, is a simple first, knowledge is power, like you just said. And then to think about why it is that, the people around us are, fall in a certain mindset compared to us is the next question. It allows us to understand each other better. And then I think the third issue is negotiation. I'm constantly, like I mentioned, negotiating with my kids, with my spouse, with colleagues over the amount of rule orientation that we're using to guide our behavior. I think it's something we can directly talk about once we have the language. I gave a workshop last year at Harvard where I met with a lot of chief learning officers who, after the workshop, they said, oh, now I have a language. Now I can go back to my organization and try to think about the kinds of conflicts we're having along tight and loose and how to manage them. And often it's the case we don't really anticipate that they're going to happen. There's a lot of examples in organizations where organizations that have veered tight are trying to loosen up. They might hire new people to make that happen, but then they have all these conflicts because there's a lot of differences that go into the tight and loose mindset, and they each are threatened by each other. People who come from a tight mindset that was very useful in the past, they feel that their control and their order is being threatened, and people from a loose mindset that are used to more flexibility, haven't had that kind of threat, have operated in a very different context, industry context, feel that their autonomy is being threatened. So once we sort of think about, okay, let's anticipate what these problems might be. It's remarkable. We've studied mergers and acquisitions around the world that, again, that you would think, there's a lot of due diligence when it comes to culture when these marriages are happening, but we can see very clearly tight loose differences really affect financial performance of these mergers. So it's good to do kind of a prenup in this sense, sort of think about, in the case of, this merger, what kind of, in a tight company, what can we give up in terms of control? Where can we introduce some discretion? We call this flexible tightness. And with loose cultures, where can you tighten up a little bit? Where can you afford to have more structure? Structured looseness, we call this. So I think it's eminently negotiable from individuals to organizations to nations, but it's something that we need to talk about ahead of time when we're trying to do so.
Can you predict who wins the midterms?
Unbiased? Yeah, it's close. It's going to be close. I will say that I think what's really great to see is that I think that the Democrats in the past, they kind of weren't acknowledging a lot of the threat that working class individuals are experiencing. And I think we see a change in that. We see that, I think, and I would say that should be a really key strategy in the Democratic Party is to be reaching out to people who are actually feeling threatened and to help provide real solutions to deal with that threat. That will help win the elections, in my view.
Michele, this is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful book of yours. And
thank you.
So thank you for being here.
Awesome. Thanks so much. You're the most fabulous interviewer ever. I could talk to you all day.
Oh, my God, girl. I think you're my new best friend. I've been speaking with Michele Gelfand. Her book is Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire Our Worlds. For more information on Michele Gelfand and her book, visit her website at michelegelfand.com. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show is a production of Resec, LLC. Be sure to tune in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show at hallicasserjayne.com or listen on your favorite app. New podcasts are posted Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern.